Good evening and welcome to our virtual Deertrails Naturalist Program. Our Deertrails Naturalist Program was first launched in 2019 in the Clearwater River Valley, where TLC protects more than 140 acres of meadow, wetlands, and forests. The program was designed to provide opportunities for the transfer of naturalist knowledge between generations. Our volunteer instructor sharing with us tonight is Lyn Baldwin.
Lyn Baldwin, and I teach at TRU, and I have taught at the Wells Gray Education and Research Center. In fact, I think 18 years ago, that's a big reason why the university hired me, is because I've been teaching a bunch of field courses, and field courses are near and dear to my heart. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Before I go any further, I want to stop by giving my deepest thanks to the Silex and the Kootenai people whose piney forests and bunch grasses helped raise me as a child. And most especially, I want to acknowledge and give thanks to the Tecumseh whose traditional territory has helped raise my daughter. And you know, we make these land acknowledgements a lot of times and they've almost become pro forma, but it's amazing how emotional I get when I think about what a gift it has been for me to live as a guest within Secwepemcúlecw for the last 18 years. And it's not overstating it to say that I wake most days extraordinarily grateful. So I want to just start with that and start with a moment of acknowledgement. And I know that you are all on traditional territories that have done the same, that have helped raise you and helped raise those people that you love. And I think we all share that, that acknowledgement. Transitioning from that, I want to explain the mess that is this title. Larissa looked at this and she went, "Oh my Lord, am I supposed to be able to decipher this?" So the original title for this talk was Seeing Through the Collections, Understanding the Role of Natural History in Colonization. And the more I thought about that, and the more I thought about what my personal lived experience could speak to, I kept changing this. I realized that I needed to alter the title. And really what I want to talk about today is understanding the role of botany in the creation of the Anthropocene. And I can't even stop with that, because really when I say botany, what I really mean is the changing relationship between plants and peoples over the last 500 to 600 years. And I think we've been truly gifted in this virtual series of talks because we've had Nancy talk about plants as relatives and the notion of kincentricity. And I want to bracket her wonderful talk with thinking about how some of the relationships and some of the tools and practices we have with plants has helped create the world, the modern world, for lack of a better word, expression. So as a prelude, that's probably the longest time I've ever taken to explain a title, but it's been an evolving talk. And I'm really grateful to have the chance to think about this and share this. So one of the things that is important to know is to situate my bias. I was originally trained as a plant ecologist, and as part of that training, I was really educated to name, count, and collect plants. And it took me a long time to actually realize, but when I look back through my field journals, I realized that I learned to draw as a mnemonic or as a way of help remembering plant names. But nearly 3 decades ago, my journal started to evolve into something more, something that before I'd even had thought to articulate it, started to change how I thought and felt about the world. And it's not what I ever intended, but today my field journals are one of the most important collections I've ever made in my life. But it was a collection that I'd never intended to make. And And I'm really grateful for that experience because it forced me to back up and think about the influence that the tools we use and the practices those tools help us cultivate, how they, tool and practice, can together can influence the relationships that develop between plants, people, and place. So part of this talk, a primary part of this talk, will be thinking through, from my perspective, the importance of tools and the practices that they engender. And of course, I am not the first to think that tools matter. In the early 1960s, in a decade when humans left footprints on the moon and color TV became mainstream, Marshall McLuhan argued that we shape our tools, and afterwards, our tools shape us. And I think that that's been an important part of my learning, is to really consider for myself what it means when I pick up a hand lens or a smartphone or a pencil or a gardening spade, what it means for me in terms of how I'm going to see the world. So on one hand, we have our tools and the practices that have developed out of those tools. And on the other hand, we have the state of the world today. And Trevor has spoken eloquently about the state of the world, and multiple of our virtual talks have made reference to the state of the world today. But it was interesting to me that 10 years after McLuhan had first commented on the influence of our tools on how we see the world, environmental historian Alfred Crosby noted a particular feature of the modern world, one that I, and I think many of us, really take for granted. And Alfred Crosby, in his book, Ecological Imperialism, said, Europeans and their descendants are all over the place, which requires some explanation. And when I first read that quote, it was shocking to me, because he goes on in multiple books to talk about that there's really no other continent, the peoples of no other continent are as widely dispersed as Europeans. And interesting, I have come to understand European, in my mind, refers to those people, including many of us, that Malia referred to in her talk, quoting Tim Lilburn, as those people who never arrived in place, who still walk 4 feet off the ground. And so European, in my mind, has less of a racial connotation and much more is a reflection of the tools and practices that we use or do not use that allow us to connect to place. And certainly this has been one of the themes running through all of our Deer Trail virtual talks. That is, that it takes effort, the cultivation of a deliberate practice for us to land in place, a willingness, as the writer Scott Russell Sanders says, to find a place and dig in. And I have the grand pleasure of being the last to go in this series of virtual talks. And I think when you look across the different talks that we've put together as part of this series, whether it's learning to see lichens in place, to understand plants as our relatives, to understand and cultivate gardens as sites of restoration, or even understanding the synchronicity that can come out of field journals, the talks that Trevor, Nancy Turner, Malia, and Bryony gave all point to the rather extraordinary influence that the cultivation of practice in place can have on who we are as a people and how we think. But as Nancy Flood pointed out in her talk, that doesn't mean that our practices, including how we allow our more than human neighbors to make themselves known to us, that doesn't mean that those practices don't carry the imprint of the Anthropocene. And here's my main thrust of this whole talk, is that if we are truly to land in place, if we are truly to become anything more than displaced Europeans, I think we have some heavy lifting to do, and that it's paramount that we question the assumptions that underlie the tools we use and the practices that we cultivate. And so that's what I want most of this talk to explore. and I have to talk from my own lived experience, and that I've kept this collection of field journals, not the collection I ever intended to make, but because of that, it has made me think long and hard about what it means to collect. And there's a difference between the word collect as a noun and as a verb. But as a verb, one very common definition is to bring or gather things together. It's interesting, and I've spent a lot of time reading art historians and historians of science thinkings about collection, and there's an extraordinary amount of debate, and the debate about what is a collection and what is not a collection really hangs on the whole notion of intent. Many people argue that a collection is made with intent. Other people argue that you can have collections that are made inadvertently. Certainly when we think of archaeological sites, those collections were not made with intent. But I don't think it matters. I have been influenced by Yuval Noah Harari, who says in his book, Sapiens, over the course of his or her life, a typical member of a modern affluent society will own several million artifacts, from cars and houses to disposable napkins and milk cartons. I think we all collect. Certainly as animals, we all feed off the greenback of this world. And so all of us, in one fashion or another, are involved in a form of plant collecting, whether we acknowledge it or not. And I think that one of the important things I want to help think my way through in this talk is, if we all collect, who or what do our collections serve? And especially those collections of plants that I'll argue we all have, even though we often don't notice them or we take them for granted. Who are those collections of plants serving besides ourselves? So that's kind of the beginning prelude of what I wanted, some of the ideas I wanted to raise. And then I want to move more directly. And I was thinking about how I wanted to start diving into the meat of this talk. And I realized that I needed to honor the season and honor where we are in our grand orbit around the sun. And so in honor of the season, this, of course, is a flower that many of us in the interior of BC know it is sagebrush buttercup. This flower is a member of the buttercup family, or Ranunculaceae, and it's certainly one of the earliest species to bloom into Kamloops. I have collected this plant more times than I can count. I've had students working on research projects on the mating system. This flower is actually really rather unusual in that it has hermaphroditic flowers, and then it also has some flowers that bear only male reproductive parts. And it is a harbinger of spring in our area. Of course, it has a relationship with the people of Kamloops that far, far outdates my relationship with this species, or even the relationship of my ancestors with this species. Sagebrush buttercups were called spring salmoni and used to indicate the return of spring, or Chinook salmon. And that was based on the color of these buttercups was evocative of the eye of Chinook salmon. Nancy Turner and her students, as well as colleagues, have articulated that the flower of this plant was used frequently as a poison on their arrowheads, as well as a poultice for warts. So this plant was used as, it was integrated into community. That's what I think about, both in terms of phenology as well as the food chain that all of us depend upon. Of course, as you can imagine, how this plant became known to science did not rely on the extensive experience that people already had with this species. So as all or many of you know, in the science of botany, plants receive their names when they are described and with a written description. And this plant received its name, was given its scientific name by Sir William Jackson Hooker in a book that he published called Flora Borealis Americana. And the description was provided by Hooker in 1840, just 1 year before he was appointed director of the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew. And this plant was named relatively late in the colonization of North America. And it's interesting because I do understand myself as a descendant of settlers and as a guest within this territory. And there's a fact about Hooker. I think he was quite an extraordinary man, but I also know that he never set foot in North America. And as a good Canadian girl, I find myself quite indignant that a man who never set foot on this continent has decided what name this plant has. And if I feel that, I can only imagine what it must have been like for those who had known this plant for millennia to find their names being eclipsed. So, but I want to, because of much of the digitization that has gone on in botany, both of botanical specimens and of works like this, we can actually look, or I can show you an excerpt from the page that describes sagebrush buttercup in its Latin name. So Ranunculus glaberimus, and you can see there's a Latin description. Still today, plants are described using a Latin description. And I have great fun trying to recognize the parts of the plant that I can in their Latin description. But in this particular description, what is specifically poignant to me is the habitat, the description of the habitat. In this, Hooker writes that it is common on the mountains around the Kettle Falls and on the Rocky Mountains near the limits of perpetual snow, italicized Douglas. This differs from all of its congeners by its entirely glabrous stem, leaves, and calyx, by its entire only three-toothed rounded radical leaves, and by the petiolate, never more than trifid Colleen loves. The whole plant has a succulent appearance and turns almost black in drying. I have seen it in no collection but that of the indefatigable Douglas. And of course, the Douglas that he is referring to here is David Douglas. And David Douglas is one of those many European plant collectors that made collecting trips to North America. And Douglas came particularly to Western North America. And he was, there are many books and many articles written about Douglas. And for our purposes, it's important to know that he was a plant collector largely in the employ of the London Horticultural Society. And when he came, he was in pursuit of specimens, both for herbarium specimens, but primarily or as well, he was also in pursuit of seeds and cuttings for the London Horticultural Society. I have paid more attention to Douglas than I think I have to many of the other previous plant collectors that I might have, partly because in 1833, Douglas made a trip up through Fort Okanagan and into Fort Kamloops. He was en route to Fort Simpson, hoping to catch a boat out of Fort Simpson to home. And eventually he got up close enough to up north, and he ended up deciding the trip was too arduous. He got to Fort St. James and turned around and came back, was headed back down the Fraser, and his canoes overturned and he lost all of the specimens. So I have mourned the loss of many of the specimens. The only thing we have left from that trip is his sketch maps, which again are digitized and you can find online. So you can see the maps he drew of Lake Kamloops as he was traveling through Kamloops, but all of the specimens are gone. The reason that Hooker could name sagebrush buttercup based on his specimens is that they were specimens that he'd already shipped home. And in fact, as many of you know, much better than I do, plants are named both based on their written description, and their names are tied to what's called a type specimen. And the type specimen for sagebrush buttercup has been digitized and has laid inert in the Kew Botanical Gardens for nearly 200 years. And I think about this plant sometimes, especially when I'm out in the spring looking at our the buttercups that appear each spring. Some of them are descendants of individuals that would have been collected. And there's no doubt that pressing a plant and making a collection of it has great value. I take it for granted, this whole notion, though, that a plant can be removed from community and still, for many, many years in my career, I never thought to consider what was lost when we took a plant away from its community. And now it's hard for me to not consider that. But I do think about these bodies that have laid inert in herbarium for centuries now. And it's also important to realize that the herbarium specimens themselves were a relatively recent innovation. There was a doctor, Luca Ghini, at the University of Bologna in the early 1500s that developed this technique. Others probably had done it, but he's the one that formalized it as a way of pressing plants and drying them. And at first he put them in books. But the reason he did that is that he wanted his students, he was a professor of medicine, he wanted his students to be able to look at the identifying characters of these plants, even when it was in winter. And even pressed and dried, there is much that can be learned from an herbarium specimen, as Trevor well knows. But the value of these herbarium specimens is hard for us in the modern world to really realize, because we live in such an image-rich world. But in the early 1500s, the best illustrations we had of plants were things like this. This is a photograph of the first English language herbal that dates to about the same time as when Guinea started creating herbarium specimens. And you can look at those images. Excuse my language, but they're crap. There's no way I would make any definitive identification of any plant based on any of those drawings. So imagine if you were trying to learn a flora, and for the first time, you could, instead of trying to decipher what these illustrations mean, you actually had the dead carcasses of those plants. Things like the trichomes would have stayed there. You would have been able to see the succulence of those of sagebrush buttercup that Hooker referred to. You would be looking at those tri-fed leaves. So there was much value that was done. At the same time, and Nancy, you'll have to help me on this, but we know that animals were made portable, but plants have a malleability about that, and you could flatten them. And of course, at the same time, many naturalists were also learning to do on-the-spot drawing, and that made the knowledge about these plants much more portable than it had been before. Their herbarium specimens were invaluable, and there is a reason that today the world's herbaria contain approximately 390 million specimens. This is a book, this number comes from a book by Barbara Tears in 2019, and she says that if distributed equally across the surface of the earth, each square mile of the Earth's surface would have 5 herbarium specimens. And other people, including many who work in herbaria, have argued that the value is immeasurable. There's this wonderful list that has been compiled by Vicki Funk, who at the time she compiled it was at the US National Herbarium at the Smithsonian. And obviously, dating back to Guinea in the early 1500s, the use of herbaria was to discover, confirm the identity of a plant, and document the concepts of the specialists who study that specimen. Of course, the flora of our world is global, and the relationships that plants have are tied to the evolution from a common ancestor. And so having specimens side by side with which to compare, I mean, I have experienced this myself, that when I'm trying to learn a flora, when I was trying to learn the mosses of Vancouver Island, having herbarium specimens to say, oh, that's what this means versus that's what that means. It's incredible. And there's all sorts of other uses and significant contributions these herbarium specimens make, especially because botanists of one sort or another have been collecting specimens now for almost 6 centuries. So as the world has been changing, we have been collecting plants. We notice the royal we there. I'm actually not a very good plant collector, but that's another topic. The royal we have been collecting 390 million specimens. And so those specimens, because they were preserved at the moment of their death, have helped us document change. So things like we can track the advance of invasive species. We can do things like track the density of stomata on leaves of plants. And it has shown distinct changes throughout time. This is the worldview I was raised with as a plant ecologist. And it took me a long time, and it was sort of shocking when I started reading environmental historians like Crosby and others, and realized that my professional ancestors were often talked about, were described as agents of empire. Other books would talk about botany, this thing that I had been devoting my life to, as a colonial practice. I think I probably came close to falling over the first time and I did not understand it. I really did not understand it. I wasn't even sure when I first read those terms that I understood the words imperialism or colonialism. And so just to bring that full front and center, what I did is I went and found, there's quite a good definition that I like from Robert Young's book, Empire, Colony, and Post-Colony from 2015. And he summarizes that imperialism is the idea, colonialism is the practice. And he says imperialism was an overarching concept or ideology that openly advocated and practiced domination over the territories of other peoples of a different race. While colonization was the practice of actual settlement or occupation, the term colonialism is used to describe the colonial system that was put into operation in the colony itself. And this, to me, is where the pedal hits the metal. Put into operation in the colony itself, whereby non-Europeans considered backward on racial grounds were ruled and exploited by European or Russian or Japanese rulers or settlers. And so when I think about David Douglas coming over here, and many people have written very eloquently about Douglas, he does not seem to have been the sort of normal run-of-the-mill person, but there was the assumption that, of course, you could take plants from this continent, that of course they should be shipped back to Hooker because he was the one that had the greatest authority of it on that. And he was the one that was to delineate one name from another. When we look at colonial powers, we know that, of course, the who's been colonial where has changed through time. So Wikipedia has a series of maps that I find helpful to look at. So we can look at colonial powers in 1800. And I know many of you have seen similar maps, that we know that the United Kingdom was colonial in Eastern Canada, as lots of other places. France, Portugal, Spain, Netherlands. was also colonial and often punched far, far, far above its landmass in terms of its impact on the global botany, as well as the Russian Empire. If you fast forward to 1945, the colonial structure differs. And so this is another map. And you can see we still have France, Portugal, Spain, and Netherlands, but we also have the United States exerting a colonial influence over the world. And the thing that I had to come to grips with was thinking about that botany has never just been a science, that when the exertion of colonial power has always been in the pursuit of more than just this neutral knowledge. And so it doesn't take much to peel back the science of botany and reveal its foundations as a business and as a colonial practice. Because when in the 15th century, Europeans took to seas in their caravels and carracks and galleons, they were in pursuit of money, not science. That doesn't mean that there weren't practitioners that were deeply invested in a scientific way of looking at the world. But in the 15th century, what translated most quickly into money were the plants known as spices, nutmeg and mace and cinnamon and cardamom. Many of those spices were, of course, as valuable as gold or silver. And so when I think about people like Douglas collecting, I think about the fact that the London Horticultural Society sent him to the land I now call home, because they knew that if they could bring back new specimens, there could be profit made. And of course, you could do science on the side, but the profit was there. Barbara Tears notes, and I didn't know about this, that Europe only has 12,000 species of plants. And so anytime anybody went abroad, there was a good chance they were going to bring back something novel, something that, that people would get excited about. So I think it's important, and there's a brand new paper that I've only received in preprint version, but that has botanists, and particularly those people that work in herbarium, have started to ask the question, do our herbaria still contain the imprint of colonialism? And the answer is, of course. So this is one of the graphs from Parks et al., which is, again, just available as a preprint right now. Okay, and let me walk you through it. So what this graph is plotting is it's plotting the number of herbarium collections that are found in country, the number of collections made of national collections versus international collections. If any given country held as many species from within national species as it did from species from abroad, then they would fall right on this line. The colors indicate continents, and the triangles indicate countries that were colonizers at some point. And circles are countries that were not a colonial power. Because we can't help it, Canada is up here in the right-hand corner. I am pretty sure this is Canada in this, North America. Canada is the blue one hidden behind there that just sneaks out in the back. The one other thing I want to tell you is that the size of the dot represents the actual size of the collection in the country's herbaria. So there's some pretty obvious things that come up, is that many, but not all, many of the countries that were never colonizers have a smaller, fewer number of collections. And they also tend to have more collections within countries than they have of collections from other countries. In comparison, those countries like the Netherlands, like the United Kingdom, and like later in its history, the United States, they have, they are either right on the line for the US, or some of those more historic colonial powers have far more international collections than they do of collections from their own country. With this in mind, it makes sense when we map the origin of those 390 million specimens by continent. And this is quite a graph. So let me back up and walk you through this. This graph is depicting the intercontinental flow of specimens from 1600 to 1945. Beneath the dotted line are the collections, beneath the dotted line is where the collections were taken from. Above the dotted line is where the collections are housed. So Europe here has these are the collections that are housed in herbaria in Europe together, and 70, the numbers on the top and the bottom are in multiples of 100,000. So what this is showing, that, and basically what we would expect, is that the herbaria in Europe house 7 million species, and that the flow of specimens in there came from South America, Oceania, North America to a small part, as well as from Europe, Asia, and Africa. Okay. Likewise, when we look at North America, you can see that the flow is less diverse. Well, I don't know if it's less diverse. We'd have to look at the exact numbers, but it does definitely demonstrate that North America and Europe have a very large proportion of the total number of specimens that are held in herbaria today. And that is why the authors of this paper put together the next graph, the last graph I'll show you from this paper. In this graph, what they are doing, this is a world map, and they have color-coded the countries of the world based on the ratio of the number of specimens that are housed in each country versus those species that were collected from each country. And the ratios below 1, which are the important ones, which are shown in blue and indicate parts of countries of the world where the number of species that have been collected from that country, so species that have been collected in the country and taken away, is higher than the number of species that have been housed in that country. And this graph is sort of the definitive graph of the paper, because this is the graph that allowed the authors to say, we demonstrate that colonial exploitation has contributed to an inverse relationship between where the plant diversity exists in nature. And I know many of us are familiar with the idea that plant diversity, not of all taxa, certainly not of brown algae, but of many taxa, increases with proximity to the equator. So the closer you get to the equator, the greater the number of species, the greater the species diversity. But the closer you get to the equator, the less likely a country is to house all of its species, and the more likely it is to have some of its species housed in herbaria elsewhere. So they go on, such disparities persist in herbaria across physical and digital realms, despite overt colonialism having ended half a century ago. They rerun the numbers for time. I only have shown you, they ran the numbers from 1945 to the present day, and the trends are very similar. So we know that this incredible resource that gives conservation biologists so many tools is disproportionately housed in many of the countries that have the fewer number of species, and also not all, but many of them were colonial powers at some point in their history. This has led people like Ross Gray and Sheila Sheikh to argue that the colonial practice of botany has been profound in shaping how we see the world. And first of all, because species are described and they are named in Latin, and there is a distinct reason why this is done that I don't disagree with, But for many, many years, I never stopped to consider the fact that naming everything in Latin favored communication across great distances and disenfranchised that of the local. So it meant that William Hooker could identify the species that Douglas sent back to him. And he also identified the mosses that Alexander von Humboldt shipped to him from South America. So Hooker was very good at what he did, but because he worked in Latin, he was able to put together information from disparate parts of the world. So favored universal language over that of the local, favored the extraction of plants, information, and labor from the community that coexisted with those plants. Many of these specimens were collected not necessarily by botanists, but often servants that were working for those botanists, including indigenous people or slaves. It also favored the erasure of indigenous knowledge and ecological practices. The information about Ranunculus glabrimus that Nancy Turner and her colleagues have documented was not a part of what Hooker was describing. And it also, these authors say, helped codify the classification that formed the base of race and sexuality. And I think that this is all really important to think about. This is the legacy of my professional ancestors and the profession that has shaped my career. But I think there is something a little even more insidious than just this that lingers in some of the practices I first learned. And that is when Bryony gave her talk, she reminded me that when she came to first visit me, I took her out to the Lac du Bois grasslands, the grasslands of the South Thompson, which is they really are one of my most treasured favorite places in the world. But I think one of the subtle shaping of scientific nomenclature, what it does and what it did for me is it provided me with the lure of supposed neutrality. Out there in the grasslands, I don't really have to, for many, many years, I didn't think I really had to worry about things like colonialism or whether my professional ancestors were agents of empire. And I think increasingly botany is coming to grips with its own history, and that botanists, we can no longer avoid the sticky complemented mess of our discipline's history. But even so, I know the pull into supposed neutrality is powerful. And I know this because I can see it in my journals. The Lac du Bois grasslands and the grasslands of the South Thompson have long been treasured places for me. But I don't live in those. I don't live alongside that botany day in, day out. Where I live, the plants I live alongside most often are of course, my garden plants. And these plants have always taken short shrift in my field journals. I have few scattered sketches, and mostly they're images that I drew as a short relief from a larger project. I rarely gave much attention to the plants that make up the flora of my tiny city lot. I lived beside these plants. I slept beside them. I pleasured in them, but I couldn't name them. I really didn't. People would ask me their names and I would say, no, those are horticultural plants. I don't know their names. And that was really my mode of operating with the plants with whom I was the most intimate. That is until we woke up to a global pandemic in March 2020. And all of a sudden I realized, like many people, that this was going to be my only botany. Maybe my only botany for an entire month, maybe worst comes to worst, an entire summer. And of course, now when we look back, all of that seems extraordinarily naive. But what I remember doing that first March, classes were canceled and I looked out and that was my only botany. And, there are some things I was trained in. So being a botanist, I made a list. And this is nothing compared to the list of plants that grows at Edgewood within those gardens. But there was a reason I had avoided my garden's botany for so long, not even worrying about colonialism. And one of the reasons I had avoided my botany for so long is the botany, the botany of gardens is complicated, and it's been complicated by human desire. I didn't even know what level, taxonomic level to start working at, because there's so many varieties of cherries that I don't know the name of. So what I decided to do was I would list just the genera that were found in my garden. And I had no idea. And it was an interesting exercise, but at the end, and there's many species that I failed to capture or that I have since introduced. But in March 2020, when I made my list, I came up with 125 genera. And frankly, I was shocked. I was shocked and I was relieved, because when I had been working with research students of mine in the Lac de Bois grasslands, we would put in plots that were not dissimilar to the size of my city lot. My city lot is like 50 feet by 120 feet. And in those similar size plots in the Lac de Bois grasslands, I would find anywhere from 60 to 80 species, not genera, species. My first thought when I counted 125 genera in my garden is I was insanely relieved, because I thought this would be enough botany to keep me occupied for a month or 2 months. And of course, it had to keep me occupied for much longer than that. So I think it's interesting to look at my relationship with plants and see how easy it was for me to other those plants that had the deepest relationship with humans in favor of those that don't. But the lesson for me was that the plants collected in my garden are not a random assortment. They're not a random sampling of the world's flora. Rather, their presence reflects this changing relationship between plants and people that has really occurred, certainly over, many people would argue, over the last 10,000 years, but I think really started to change 500 and 600 years ago. And I think that if there are lessons to learn from the specimens that are collected in the world's herbarium, there are also lessons to be learned from the collection of plants that we find in our garden, not the least of which is another early emerging plant. If sagebrush buttercup is the first flower to emerge in the grassland, then lowly rhubarb is the first plant to provide edible food in my garden. And I don't know about you, but I probably eat rhubarb once a year. When it first comes up, my husband makes an amazing rhubarb tart, and we eat it once a year. I collect its flowers because it's a Polygonaceae. It's great flowers to show students when I'm teaching field botany. And other than that, I completely ignore this rather extraordinary plant. I didn't even know it was the genus was native to, because it's just a horticultural variety. I don't really care. So during the pandemic, I learned to care more. And of course, rhubarb belongs to the genus Rheum, and Rheum contains approximately 60 species, including, look at this plant. I'd never known it existed, the noble Rheum nobile. Like, now that's a plant. Yes, sometimes I do lust after exotic plants. I can't say it, but so it's as a genus, it's native to Eastern Europe, Southern and Eastern temperate Asia. And in the center of its range, species of rhubarb have been long valued for their medicinal use. Interestingly, small doses treated diarrhea, higher doses were used as a laxative or emetic. So rhubarb, it's, I think, one of the most ignored garden plants in North America, but in Asia and Eastern Europe, it's long been valued for its use as a medicinal plant. And it was so valued that in the early 1600s, and there's a wonderful science of botany paper that I learned this from, that in the early 1600s, there were botanists like John Evelyn in England that were obsessed with trying to grow medicinally potent rhubarb in England. At the same time, peasants in Siberia were petitioning their czar to say, look, I can't pay taxes this year because you've had me on work gangs searching for rhubarb that I haven't had enough time to plant my crops. Of course, what both the English gardeners and the Siberian peasants were after, they weren't after stalk, they weren't after leaves, they were after rhubarb root, and particularly of the root of Rheum palmatum. And Rheum palmatum is not what we grow in our gardens, but Rheum palmatum is colloquially been referred to as Turkish rhubarb or Chinese rhubarb. And this is the rhubarb that was known for years due to the chemicals, because plants, of course, are masters of biochemistry. The secondary metabolites that they produce, that is what had been identified as medicinally potent. And because different species have faced different evolutionary pressures, they produce different secondary metabolites. So what I think about when I think about the rhubarb in my garden now is how this plant got caught up in this web of human desire. And what that makes me think about is that the plants that we cultivate in our gardens, that we use in our to beautify our yards or to eat, they are all cultural descendants of this this relationship we've had with some parts of the world flora. And this comes back to the whole fact that because plants produce secondary metabolites, they've had a pull on our biology and our desire for many, many, many millennia. So when Columbus sailed west across the Atlantic Ocean, of course, he was searching for new access to plants known for their secondary metabolites. Many of the plants that I mentioned before, cloves, cardamom, cinnamon, nutmeg. And the desire for these secondary metabolites and the profits that could result, many people now describe as an early engine of globalization, driving Europe's imperial project. Sometimes I think about those men who sailed west on the carracks and caravels. Could they have imagined the trouble that was going to follow in their wake? The way that the roots of the ships that would follow behind, the ships that recently digitized shipping logs of the 18th, 19th century, the tracks of these ships actually allow the outline of the earth land masses to be seen, revealing the continents that these early people traversing the Atlantic were actually in search of. If the search for spices was an early engine of globalization, there's no doubt that globalization has occurred to such large effect that we take it for granted that yet another collection of plants, I will argue that almost all of us have, make it easy for us to take for granted that you can have plants native to the Banda Islands, to the South Pacific, that you can readily purchase and have in your spice cupboard. Because of course, so many of our spices, and I'm speaking specifically here about nutmeg, our house is full of a global botany that we take for granted. And we take for granted because our relationship with plants has changed in such a way that we expect to be able to access the world's botany by going to our local grocery store. One of the things that has really become clear to me, however, is if spices were the early engine of globalization, our quest, our changing relationship with plants did not just stop with spices. And in fact, one of the most profound drivers of global change was not spices, but with spices, but also through the crops that people were using, not necessarily just for their secondary metabolites, these crops that were replanted across the world. And if we go back to my list of garden plants, My garden's garlic, lettuce, spinach, peaches, cherries, and pears first arrived in the New World in 1493 on Columbus's second voyage. In contrast, my garden's potatoes, tomatoes, and chili peppers were plants of the Americas that first went east along with vanilla, corn, and tobacco before returning back to North America as domesticated crops. So you have when I say that the flora of our spice cabinet and our kitchens and our refrigerators is a global botany, it is because we have both new and old world native plants mixed together in ways that we just take for granted. But this is the thing that once I started to realize, like it staggers my imagination that we have all these species at our disposal. And of course, there's always a cost associated with that. So this is what Alfred Crosby, who I quoted early, talked about as the Colombian exchange. And the Colombian exchange, of course, is the exchange of plants. And because plants rarely travel alone, plants, animals, disease, human, and ideas between the old and new world. And it's funny, we understand this in a way that I think we might not have 3 years ago, and way more immediate, because we understand that when we humans travel, disease travels with us. And packed in alongside their crops and livestock, Europeans carried, of course, smallpox, measles, typhus, and cholera to the New World, with catastrophic result for the indigenous peoples of Americas. And estimates vary, but some of the more recent estimates indicate that anywhere from 80, probably much more like 90 to 95% of the New World indigenous population, so approximately 50 to 60 people, perished in the wake of European arrival. And the consequences reverberated throughout the ecosystem, because with the loss of so many hands that had cultivated fields, that had burned forests to plant crops, the widespread genocide that was driven by both disease, but then also by the cultural attitudes Europeans had to indigenous bodies that could be used for labor. What you see, and this argument is still, people make it and then still waffle about it a little bit, but there is increasing argument that the widespread tree and forest regrowth in the New World that occurred in the wake of the genocide of the indigenous populations, the growing forests may have sucked down so much carbon that it actually ushered in the Little Ice Age, which was a period of pronounced cold from 1500 to 1850. And Lewis and Maslin have a wonderful book called The Human Planet that goes into this in much detail. The impacts of the Colombian exchange were caused not just through the loss of indigenous population, but because not only once Europeans arrived in the New World, they understood that some parts of the New World were fabulous, had exactly the perfect growing conditions to grow crops like sugarcane, tobacco, and eventually cotton that were very, very profitable. And so however, the conditions in these terrible, I think of these places where these crops were grown and are growing, they exemplify a certain relationship between plants and people. And the writer Howard French, we call these places plantations, and plantations almost sounds pretty to me, but Howard French calls these places prison industrial labor camps. And certainly the life expectancy for anybody who was an enforced laborer or a slave in those places was on average 5 to 7 years. Of course, indigenous people were first forced to do that. And when Europeans ran out of indigenous bodies, they imported enslaved Africans. So much so that writer Charles Mann says that the transformation of North America that occurred in the wake of Columbus at the first several centuries was wrought largely by African hands. So you have spices driving that relationship, that lust, that desire for particular plants, driving globalization. You have these horrible relationships between plants and people, where sugar and tobacco and later cotton were grown. But then you also have this widespread shuffling of the world's botany, so much so that that historian William McNeill says that potatoes, by feeding rapidly growing populations, permitted a handful of European nations to assert dominion over most of the world between 1750 and 1950. And what that meant is that because you had the world's farmers shuffling what crops were grown where, Maslin and Lewis, as well as Crosby, argued that you basically increase the caloric output of the world. And for Europeans, this meant that famine, while not completely extinguished, the frequency of famine went way down, populations increased, and that led fairly quickly to European populations increasing. And there was, where else were these new Europeans going to go other than the New World and to other places? And that's what Alfred Crosby calls the Neo-Europe. So these are the regions across the world, often in temperate latitudes, where there was direct subjugation and genocide of indigenous people. Europeans reseeded, replanted these places with the crops, including introducing cash crops like tobacco. And the consequence for the world is now that together, cropland and pastures have become one of the largest terrestrial biomes on the planet, occupying approximately 40% of the ice-free land surface. Okay, so everybody's with me. We have this Colombian exchange, and historians talk about this, environmental historians, and for me, what's really interesting is that what was also being exchanged was a way of being with plants, right? And that when you think about the cropland and pastures that we see distributed across the world, that was a different way of being with plants than had been practiced in those places since time immemorial. And I'm enough of a scientist to say I don't want to place judgment yet. I want to understand the biological and cultural consequences of those ways of being before I decide whether I want to support that way of being or not. And so it was very interesting for me to read. James Scott has a wonderful book called Against the Grain, and he says that the agriculture that we have today, and I include my garden in this, I include many people's garden in this, he describes it as the cultural descendant of what he calls the domus. And the domus, he says, and I'm going to share this phrase with you, or this thing, he says the domus, which dates, depending on who you're talking to maybe 10,000, maybe 8,000 years ago, as a late Neolithic multi-species resettlement camp. And his argument, and this whole book is all about the evolution of agriculture and whether people settled down first or started planting crops. And it may be that the most interesting part of that is those are the wrong questions to ask, because Scott is arguing that what we have is that some people in some places developed a coevolutionary relationship born out of the domestication of fire. Fire was critically important, plants, some animals, including a particular hominid, and an extraordinary variety of commensals, those hangers-on, including scavengers, and the zoonoses that always move from one animal species to another when we live in close proximity to one another. So This is a multi-species resettlement camp in which the relationship we have with plants, as well as all those who feed off of plants like us, where those relationships begin to shift and mutate. And largely what Scott is arguing is that without worrying about what caused it, we know that we started to live in increasing proximity with certain animals and with certain crops. And it wasn't necessarily an easier way to live a life or to survive, but fundamentally, this influenced the evolution of all the species involved, including us. And many ecologists have gone back, and evolutionary biologists have gone up and said, really, agriculture and this domus is an example of the niche construction that's practiced by many species. I think of the beaver that have been constructing a lodge on the North Trail of Sky Pond. Termites are another example. So from a scientific perspective, this is an example of niche construction. But within that multi-species resettlement camp, you can see that we start to shape species into tools. And many people, we go back to that idea that I started with, that we shape our tools and our tools shape us. Within that domus, plants start to become one of the most instrumentalized of all forms and degraded and often overlooked. And Ross Gray and Sheila Sheikh today are saying this with reference to how that utilization of plants as tools has continued on. But James Scott draws attention to the fact that we shape our tools and then our tools shape us. So he thinks, and this is a really important thing from my perspective, is what's the consequence for Homo sapiens as a species within this multi-species resettlement camp? And he argues that for multiple reasons, and there's good evidence that people, certainly in the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia, they settled in place first, but then as they started to pay more attention to the domus and less attention to the surrounding areas, although it was never only one, that Scott argues there was a constriction of space and time, that we became more obligated to a smaller space and our time was more constrained. There is very good evidence from the archaeological record that we had a massive constriction of diet. Scott argues there was a contraction of ritual life. We know, we've lived through the expansion of disease that can occur when species jump from one, and when disease jumps from one species to another. There was a loss of intimate knowledge of the natural world, including its plants. And again, Scott quotes a lot of archaeological evidence that shows that number of plants that people used on a regular basis plummeted astronomically after they started living more and more in the domus. Scott talks less about this, but certainly lots of other conservation biologists have looked across, and one of the issues that we have with gardens like mine and with many other gardens is that we tend to all plant the same species. In those Alfred Crosby's Neo-Europes, we come bearing these ideas that we should have a lawn and we have all the same flowers. And so multiple research projects have shown that, yes, gardens like mine have a surprising diversity, but they repeat each other from one garden to the next to the next. And for me, this matters because for better or worse, this is where I live. And I think that part of us learning to land in place, to get to no longer walk 4 feet off the ground, is accepting the consequences of what our ancestors brought along with us. And of course, the Indigenous poet and scholar Jeanette Armstrong has this amazing poem where she reminds us that out of the belly of Christopher's ship, a mob bursts, running in all directions, pulling furs off animals, shooting buffaloes, shooting each other left and right. Pioneers and traders bring gifts, smallpox, Seagrams, and Rice Krispies. There is no doubt in my mind that part of what burst out of Christopher's ship was also botany, this discipline to which I've devoted most of my life, it feels like. And it can be hard. It can be hard to try to imagine how we're ever going to find the way to land in place. But I take great solace that from a distance, the world may be blue, but the terrestrial world is always green. And in collections big and small, there are the plants, and those who have stewarded them for longer than I can imagine, they are there with lessons to teach. And I think what's been really interesting for me is that the humanities, anthropologists and poets and artists of all sorts, have recognized the lessons that plants have to teach us even before botanists. Natasha Myers is an anthropologist at York University, and she has this quote, which I love. She says, the photosynthetic ones, those green beings we have come to know as cyanobacteria, algae, and plants, are sun worshippers and worldly conjurers, lapping up sunlight, inhaling carbon dioxide, drinking in water, and releasing oxygen. They literally make the world. Pulling matter out of thin air, they teach us the most nuanced lessons about mattering and what really matters. Their beings and their doings have enormous planetary consequence. I think today, when we are so worried, if we can reimagine our relationship with plants, and that means coming to terms and accepting the full complexity of the way these relationships have changed, then I have to accept that there are lessons to be learned from both sagebrush buttercup and garden rhubarb. Neither of these plants were ever caught within the brutal relationships between plants and peoples called plantations. Neither caused the enforced slavery or genocide of millions and millions of people displaced from Africa. But I think both of them can help us reimagine our relationship when we slow down to notice them. And Natasha Meyer goes on to argue that reimagining the relationship between people and plants is nothing less than a first step in reimagining a future of diverse and necessarily sustainable human-plant relations in a world of ongoing change. And part of this is just the numbers. We live in a world where plants form more than 80% of the living biomass of the terrestrial world. We live in a world where we humans are the greatest evolution and an ecological force, whether we want it or not. How we think about plants matters. The last thing I want to talk about is a question that if both sagebrush, buttercup, and rhubarb have lessons to teach, why bother immersing ourselves in a place like in Wells Gray? I think this is an important question, and I think it's really important to talk about this in the context of this series, because part of landing in place, part of finding a way to dig in, is really accepting the challenge of what it means to indigenize to place. And indigenize to place is a scary word for me to use, but in her kind and gracious way, Jeanette Armstrong, in a talk she gave, a TED talk she gave in 2011, says, indigeneity to a place, she sees it as an adaptation over a long period to the realities of that place in ways that promote interdependence. Not long afterwards, from a completely different continent, the philosopher Martin Lee Mueller argued or described indigeneity is the difficult and never fully finished skill of living in place, Learning to live in place involves gleaning thought structure from the patterned animation that is specific to each place. When I look at the field journal pages that I complete in Edgewood's garden, or when I complete on the trail headed up to Table Mountain, what I know is that it is in these places that I can bear the weight of what botany has done. I can bear the weight, maybe I can pretend, but it feels more able for me to comprehend the full legacy of my discipline, of my place in this world. And at the same time, there's the capacity to really sense that patterned animation. I think I go to Wells Gray so that I can return home with the understanding that my world, your world, is home to these wondrous alien beings called plants, organisms that breathe without lungs, that gossip on the wind, that know the fidelity demanded by roots, that paint the world in flower, that never, ever, ever walk 4 feet above the ground. And I think we collect their bodies in our herbarium, our gardens, our kitchens, our windowsill. We live alongside them more often than I'd like. They slip into our background. But I think if we can see them as our green neighbors, as Nancy Turner says, our relatives, the more chance we give ourselves to ultimately land in place. And I think the question is that if all of us are collectors, and I'll argue that given the trophic reality of our world, all of us are collectors. But if all of us are collectors and every collection tells a story, then isn't the most important question we have to answer as individuals and as a society? The question we have to answer is, what story do we want our collection to tell? Thanks, you guys. Thanks for sticking in there with me.